This is Living Power with Dan Hurst.
Discover some amazing contrasts in the Gospel of John. On the one hand, you're going to see a remarkable simplicity in the way that John speaks and says what he has to say. And then on the other hand, some amazing depth and really even some intimidating insight on the life of Christ and how it relates to us. There's so much practical truth in the Gospel of John, it will just absolutely amaze you. But I want to lay some groundwork today and start digging into some of this truth. And I want us to see something about John. You're going to fall in love with the Apostle John. There was something about this guy that is just so endearing, and you will begin to see that, I think, even today. One of the verses that I love in the book of Acts says this about John, Acts 4:13. Now when they saw the boldness of Peter and John and perceived that they were uneducated, common men, they were astonished, and they recognized that they had been with Jesus. Now I long for people to say that about us, that we're just common people. You know, and that the world recognizes that we're just common people, but that we have been with Jesus. I really want that for my life, and I want that for you also. So, who was John? Who was this Apostle John? John was the youngest of the disciples of Jesus. His father's name was Zebedee. What a great name. Zebedee. Almost makes you want to... No, I'm not going to get into that Zebedee-doodah thing. But anyway, John's mother was a woman named Salome. And we read over in Mark 15 and John 19 that Salome was the sister of Mary, mother of Jesus. And so that makes John Jesus' cousin. Now, that's important because when John declares over and over and over again that Jesus is God, he knows what he's talking about. He grew up with him, and he probably knows Jesus better than anyone else. He just knows him. He grew up with him. He knows what he's like. He knows who he is. His mother was also a follower of Jesus. I find this interesting. In Matthew 27, starting with verse 55, there were also many women there, this was at the cross, there were also many women there looking on from a distance who had followed Jesus from Galilee, ministering to him. Among them were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of the sons of Zebedee. Of course, that would be John's mother. Then in Mark 15, we find out who that is. Mark 15, verse 40. There were also women, this is also referring to that same time. There were also women looking on from a distance, among whom were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, the younger, and of Joseph, and Salome. Salome. That was who was there, the wife of Zebedee, the mother of John. Now look at this. When he was in Galilee, Jesus, they followed him and ministered to him. And there were also many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem. Salome was a follower of Jesus. And so I'm sure she didn't become a follower of Jesus until his ministry started. And until after John became one of the disciples. But it's important to understand that apparently this family was focused on things of God. And although John's father Zebedee was a fisherman, and we don't really hear a lot about him in the Bible, apparently he was a pretty good father, and he had brought his children up. And as a matter of fact, his children were following in his footsteps as a fisherman. He was probably pretty successful because we read in the Gospel of Mark that when Jesus called James and John to the ministry, Mark 1:20 says, and immediately he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired servants and followed him. So he had hired servants. So he had a business. And it wasn't just a little family business. Apparently, he had people working for him. And so they were probably of some means anyway. Now, the question that comes up always anytime we talk about the calling, and we'll delve into this at another time, another Sunday, but why would these young men, along with all of the other disciples, probably in their 20s, just get up and walk away from their jobs to follow Jesus? Well, aside from the prompting of the Holy Spirit, the next two verses in Mark give us some insight to that. Mark 1, picking up with verse 21. And they went to Capernaum, these Jesus had called these guys to follow him. He said, "You come with me." And they left their jobs and they followed him. And the next verse says, and they went to Capernaum. And immediately on the Sabbath, which was probably the next day, immediately on the Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and was teaching, and they were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one who had authority and not as the scribes. I mean, they immediately saw something in Jesus. They understood that this guy is speaking some powerful truth, and that's what they wanted to be a part of. We'll spend a little more time looking at that in a few Sundays. Now, John was apparently very, very close to Jesus. We have some tremendous insight from John as to what Jesus was thinking and saying. John must have spent a lot of time listening and observing and learning from Jesus. And John knowing Jesus, and Jesus knowing John's character and the quality of person that he was, asked him, when Jesus was on the cross, he asked John to watch over his mother when Jesus was dying. Now, Eusebius, who was he was actually the bishop of Caesarea, but he was also a historian, wrote a lot of Roman history. And he indicates that John stayed in Jerusalem and did indeed take care of Jesus' mother for the following 15 years. She lived another, according to Eusebius, she lived another 15 years after Jesus died and rose again. Mary lived another 15 years, and that John watched over her during those 15 years. John was not known to be a brilliant preacher. He may have been, but he wasn't known for that. He did travel some and preach in a few churches in Asia Minor. In fact, he was with Paul at least for part of one of his journeys. He apparently lived a few years in Ephesus and ministered there and to some other churches in that area. Toward the end of his life, he was banished to a little island called Patmos, which is one of the Greek islands. If you can picture Greek in your mind, Greece and all of the islands, Patmos is all the way over, as far over to the east as you can get before you hit Turkey. And it's just off of the coast of Turkey. And it was one of those little islands that they kind of treated as a kind of like a prison. They would just dump prisoners off there and just leave them to their own ways on the island. They weren't allowed to leave the island, of course, and they were just dumped there to take care of themselves. And he was dumped on this island, banished by Domitius, who was a Roman emperor and a persecutor of Christians. And he stayed there, and that's where he wrote the book of Revelation while he was there. And then after Domitius died, actually he was assassinated, after that John was freed from Patmos, and he came back and apparently lived in Ephesus and lived out his years. It's believed that John was not martyred, that he died of old age, and probably died in Ephesus or somewhere close by. Now, I want you to see a couple of things about the Gospel of John. 93% of the Gospel of John is material that you will not see in any other Gospel record. Now, here are just a few of the things that you won't find in the Gospel of John, as you will in the other Gospels. There is no description of his birth, of the birth of Jesus, no details of the youth of Jesus, no record of his baptism or his temptation in the wilderness, no account of the transfiguration or of the Garden of Gethsemane. John records none of Jesus' parables. In fact, the Gospel of John covers only 21 days of Jesus' life, 21 days of his ministry. 3.5 years of ministry, but John only covers 21 days of it. And of that, 10 chapters are devoted to describing 1 week of his ministry. And 1/3 of the verses cover a single 24-hour period in the life of Jesus. Now, we're not exactly sure what the historical reason was why John wrote his gospel. One tradition says that the bishops in Asia Minor had requested John to write the gospel to deal with the heresy that many believed at that time, or asserted, not many, but there were some that were asserting that Christ did not exist before Mary. And so one of the traditions is that the bishops asked him to write that, to speak to that. And who better? Somebody who was not only a disciple of Jesus, but also grew up with him and knew him well. One thing that we do know is from John's own statement of purpose, which is found in John chapter 20, verses 30 through 31. And if you're using your Bibles, I would strongly recommend that you underline this and memorize these two verses. Now, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. Now look at verse 31. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in His name. That's the central focus of John. Everything that happens in John pivots on verse 31. So everything that we look at in the Gospel of John has to be interpreted in the light of what verse 31 is all about. Interestingly, the key word in the Gospel of John is the word believe, and it's mentioned 98 times. John wrote so that people would believe who Jesus is. Both the historical historical narratives and the teachings in the Gospel of John appear to be chosen. There's a rhyme and reason to it once you get into it, because what he talks about are all focus attention on the specific claims of Jesus. John isn't interested in biographical and historical study. That's not his focus. That's not what he does. He simply seeks to clarify and to substantiate who Jesus is. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called synoptic Gospels because they share similar views and they tell the same stories and they essentially affirm the same history. The Gospel of John, on the other hand, introduces us to a whole lot of new information, a lot of new things that we see about Jesus that you won't find in the other Gospels. A major difference is that the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, concentrate on the Galilean ministry, and John concentrates on the Jerusalem ministry. You have to remember that when you compare things that Jesus said. For example, if we compare something that Jesus said in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it may seem like it's different than what he said in the Gospel of John. And the reason is because Jesus was talking to a whole different set of people, different lifestyles from different regions, different attitudes. There are different reasons that Jesus approached, in different ways that Jesus approached people in different areas. And so you have to remember that when you're studying John and comparing it to the other Gospels. We don't know exactly when it was written, but it's generally assumed that it was written. There's one camp that says it was written probably around 60 A.D. There's another camp that says it was probably written at the very end of his life, around 90 A.D. Right from the very beginning of the Gospel, John claims the deity of Christ. That's the very first thing that we find in the Gospel of John. In fact, he purposefully uses language that reflects the story of the creation of Genesis. Look at this. In Genesis chapter 1, this is what it says. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Now, look at how John begins his gospel, almost reflecting on that very, very same passage of Scripture. He says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through Him all things were made. Without Him nothing was made that has been made. In Him was life, and that life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not understood it." Now, there are two things that John establishes immediately about Jesus. I'm not going to be able to finish this lesson today because you were so busy visiting at the beginning of class, and it's your fault. But we'll pick it up next Sunday anyway. But I want us to get into these two things that John establishes immediately about Jesus. First of all, he establishes that Jesus is the Word. He uses that term, the Word, and it's very carefully chosen. The Greek word for word is the word logos. And logos is a thought or a concept or the expression or utterance of that thought. And it's very important that he use that word. He chose that word specifically. If you were a first century Jew or Greek, you would know exactly what John was referring to. You see, the Greeks referred to the Word as that, probably the best way to say it is that it was an impersonal force that created and controlled the universe. They wouldn't necessarily refer to it as God, but they did refer to it as knowledge. that some all-knowing thing or being or someone controlled the universe. And they referred to it as knowledge, which is the word for logos. So they would refer to the logos of the universe, which is that which controls the universe and brought the universe into existence. It was a philosophical thing. It was big. And the Greeks spent a lot of time discussing this and philosophizing about it. So for him to use the word logos, the Greeks understood this. This said something to them. The Jews, on the other hand, thought of the word logos as the creative, controlling force of God. In other words, it was the expression of God. There was God, but there was the logos, which was the authority and the creative power of God that would control the universe. And so to them, logos referred to that knowledge that God had that created and controlled the universe. Now, John throws a firebomb into their thinking when he says to the Jews and to the Greeks that the logos is Jesus Christ. In fact, over in Revelation, John says the logos is actually a title of Christ. Look at Revelation 19, verse 11. And I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse, and he who sat upon it is called Faithful and True. And in righteousness he judges and wages war. And his eyes are a flame of fire, and upon his head are many diadems. And he has a name written upon him which no one knows except himself. And he is clothed with a robe dipped in blood, and his name is called the Logos of God. So what does John establish about Jesus being the Logos? Back in John chapter 1, beginning with verse 1. There are some things, there are four things that he says about this Logos, this Jesus who is the Word of God. First of all, he says that he is eternally God. He says this Logos, this Jesus, you guys need to know this right from the very beginning. He is eternally God. In the beginning was the Logos. In the beginning, he was there. Now this phrase, by the way, doesn't imply that the Word had a beginning. It means that the Word has always existed, but it was our beginning, human history. He was there. He was at the beginning of it. The word was is in the imperfect tense, and it means an action of the past that continues to the present and continues to continue. In fact, if you want to define it a little better, if you were writing it exactly the way the word is intended to be used, you would say, in the beginning was the Word, is the Word, and always will be the Word. That's the Logos. The Logos always was, is, and always will be. In the beginning, this Logos was there. So he is eternally God. That's the very first statement that John comes out with. It's an amazing statement. And this has been debated through centuries. Is Jesus God or is he not? And I'm amazed at the number of people, and by the way, I think it's important that we point out that there is no adjective in front of the word in front of the word word. There is no adjective there, meaning that in the beginning, as our Jehovah's Witnesses friends believe, that he was a God. It's not there. That adjective doesn't exist, and what it literally means is he is God. It literally says that he is God, and in fact, if you don't believe that, then you go to John chapter 5, verse 28, where it says that Jesus is God. It literally says that. So John establishes this very important principle that we have to know that Jesus is God, which was a firebomb, as I mentioned earlier, for the Jews and for the Greeks. He also says that Jesus is the expression of God. He is the expressiveness of God, if you will. Jesus is everything God has ever said or will say. He is that Logos, that everything God has ever said, everything God has ever done is Jesus. He is the Logos of God. He is everything God in human form. This was mind-boggling for them. This was it was just so huge, they had trouble getting their arms around it. We have trouble getting our arms around it. And then he says he is essentially God. He is all God. The statement, and the Word was God, is, just like I mentioned earlier, it's the clearest statement of the deity of Jesus in the Bible. He's not a God, He is God. It's not even He is the God, because that would imply that there are other gods. It just says Jesus is God. The Word is God. Not only is the Word co-eternal, the Logos, not only is He co-eternal and co-equal with God, He is God. That's why Jesus could say things like John 8:58, I tell you the truth, Jesus answered, before Abraham was born, I am. Which was a real amazing statement to the Jews, because I am was a word that God used for Himself. And then John 10:30, Jesus said, I and the Father are one. And what He was saying was, I and the Father are the same. It's not that we're together, that we're joined together, that the two of us are it's not that. He wasn't saying that. It wasn't like two people get married, become one. That's not what He was saying. What He was saying was, the Father and I are the same. That's what He was saying. And then the fourth thing that John establishes right in that very beginning passage is that Jesus is the maker of creation. He is the creator. When you consider that this verse tells us that Jesus was the creator of the universe, His birth as a baby at Christmas that we just celebrated becomes even more amazing. Think about this. The creator of the universe humbled Himself and became a creature in the universe. What an amazing statement. What an amazing thing happened. God became dependent on a human mother. Jesus, the agent of creation, stepped out of eternity, laid aside His glory, entered the world as a human baby for the sole purpose of paying for your sin. That was the only reason He did it. The only reason He did it was because He can't stand the idea of spending eternity without you. He created you, the individual that you are, the unique individual that you have always been and that you always will be. He created you, and He has a purpose and a plan for your life. You know, I look at our group here, and I see some folks who have lived a long, wonderful life. We have some young guys here who are just getting started in their lives. I want both of you to understand, and everybody in between, that God created you as an individual, a unique design. Nobody ever has been like you, nobody will be, because God has a purpose and a plan for your life. And because He has a purpose and a plan for your life, He is so uniquely interested in you, in everything that's going on in your life. And He loves you and can't stand the idea of spending eternity without you, and therefore He came to pay the price for your sin and was willing to die on the cross just so He could spend eternity with you. You see, Jesus knew He was going to rise from the dead. He knew when He went to the cross, it wasn't a question like, oh boy, I hope I rise from this. It wasn't that. Jesus knew what was going to happen. But even more importantly, He wanted to make sure that you knew it was going to happen. And so He gave Himself and He rose from the dead and He paid for sin if you're willing to accept that in your life. Jesus came as this human baby. The creator of creation humbled Himself by becoming a part of the creation itself. Not only did He make the universe, but He is the power that holds the universe together. Colossians chapter 1 verse 16 says, for by Him all things were created. Things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things were created by Him and for Him. He is before all things, and in Him all things hold together. Wow! This Jesus that John is talking about is God. Now take a look at what we know scientifically. Our great planet doesn't travel in a true circle. We know that. It travels in three directions pretty much at the same time. It revolves on its axis, it travels around the sun, and its path is sometimes deflected by other planets. Still, it doesn't lose more than 1/100th of a second every 100 years. Somebody's in control. Then we look at the building block of the universe, which is the atom. We know that because we're smart. And this is an entity that is so small that each atom is less than, get this, each atom is less than 150 millionth of an inch in diameter. If you could take the molecules of a single drop of water, now think about this, all of the molecules in a single drop of water, and take each one of those molecules and blow it up to the size of a grain of sand, each molecule in a drop of water, if you could do that and blow it up to a grain of sand, there would be enough sand to build a concrete highway 1/2 mile wide, 1 foot thick, all the way from New York to San Francisco. The beauty of all of that is that there are 120 drops of water in a single teaspoon. Imagine what you could do with that. Now, this is the way God designed it. This is what God was up to. You combine that with the fact that one cell of your body contains 200 billion molecules of atoms. Whether you look at the universe with a telescope and see how big it is, or look at it with a microscope and see how small it is, when you see the order, the symmetry, the harmony, the beauty of all that it is, only a fool would conclude that God did not do it and that God is not in control. You'd have to be really a moron to think that way. So what does it all mean? It may seem that your world is spinning out of control, but it isn't. Your God is in control. It is all in the hands of the one who made it. And all things are working toward the purpose for which he designed. But what is, in my opinion, the greatest manifestation of God's power? You might have a different answer, but some would say it was his creation or his miracles, or others would talk about the cross, and some would center on the resurrection. All of those are wonderful manifestations of his power. But I submit to you that the greatest expression of God's power was when he added humanity to his deity and came to live on earth, because he loved you so much. Philippians 2, verse 6 through 8 says it this way, talking about Jesus, who being in the very nature God, not being like God, he was God. In his nature, he is God. In other words, his very nature is God. He is God. And he didn't consider it equality with God to be something to be grasped, because he was God. It wasn't something to attain. He was God. He didn't have to attain it. He is God. But he made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even the death on a cross. The one who made it all and continues to control it lived here in poverty, suffered rejection, only to die a horrible death on the cross. And he did it for one reason. Romans 5:8 says it this way: God demonstrates his own love for us, in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us.